They didn't even stand when I walked into the White House ceremony hall, just sat there with their arms crossed like I was still the disappointment who'd gone soft in basic training. My dress blues gleamed under the chandeliers, the Medal of Honor heavy in the president's hands, but all I could see were their faces. The same disgust they'd worn 5 years ago when I refused to pull that trigger. They called me a coward then. Today they'd learn what real courage looked like. The rain hammered the roof of the Henderson family farm in rural Nebraska like artillery fire, each drop exploding against the tin with the same relentless rhythm I'd learned to sleep through in Forward Operating Base Chapman. But the storm brewing inside the farmhouse kitchen was something no deployment had prepared me for. I stood in the doorway where I'd announced my enlistment 7 years ago, my Army combat uniform still damp from the 3-hour drive from Fort Riley. Water dripped from my boots onto the worn linoleum floor that hadn't changed since I was 7 years old, practicing drill formations with the plastic army men my father gave me every Christmas. The same floor where I'd done push-ups as punishment for questioning his orders. The same floor where I'd bled from a split lip when I'd dared suggest that maybe, just maybe, there were different ways to win a fight than overpowering your opponent. Nobody offered me a towel, nobody said welcome home, nobody even looked up from their plates. The silence stretched like a tripwire, taut and dangerous. Outside, lightning illuminated the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. The same fields where I'd learned to shoot my first rifle at age 8. Where I'd proven I could hit a target at 200 meters before I was old enough to drive. Where my father had smiled, actually smiled, for the first time I could remember, and told me I might make a soldier after all. That felt like a lifetime ago. My father, Colonel Marcus Henderson, Rat, sat at the head of the mahogany dining table like he always had, spine straight as a flagpole despite being out of the Army for 8 years. His dress uniform might have been hanging in the closet upstairs, but he still wore authority like other men wore cologne, heavy and unmistakable. His steel gray eyes swept over my uniform with the same clinical precision he'd once used to inspect his soldiers, cataloging every detail. The combat patch on my right shoulder marking my deployment to Afghanistan, the Ranger tab I'd earned after 3 tries and more pain than I'd thought possible, the ribbons that told the story of 2 deployments, 3 commendations, and 1 incident that had nearly ended my career before it began. His expression didn't change. Just that familiar look of disappointment, the same one he'd worn when I'd come home from basic training and told him I'd volunteered for medic training. Like I was still the recruit who'd failed to meet his standards, who'd chosen healing over killing, who'd proven that Henderson blood could run thin after all. Sarah. His voice was flat, formal, stripped of any warmth. Not honey, like he'd called me as a child. Not soldier, like he'd grudgingly started calling me after I'd made it through infantry training. Just my first name, spoken like it left a bad taste in his mouth. My rankless, accomplishmentless, disappointment of a name. My mother, Linda Henderson, sat beside him like she had for 28 years of marriage, 23 of them as an Army wife. She knew how to pack a household in 6 hours, how to make friends in new towns within a week, and how to read military decorations like sheet music. Her pale blue eyes, the ones I'd inherited along with her stubborn streak, lingered on my chest for just a moment too long, taking inventory of the ribbons and badges I'd earned since I'd last been home. The Bronze Star with Valor device that she didn't know about, the Purple Heart I'd never mentioned in my letters, the Combat Medical Badge that told its own story of battlefield courage under fire. She looked away as if the sight of them burned her, focusing instead on the pot roast she'd barely touched. Her wedding ring caught the light as she pushed peas around her plate. The same nervous habit she'd had when I was growing up, and Dad would come home angry about something that had happened at the base. Some soldier who'd disappointed him. Some subordinate who'd failed to live up to the Henderson standard. My brother Jake slouched in his chair across from where I stood, still wearing his Dodge County Sheriff's Department uniform from his evening shift. The detective's shield on his chest gleamed under the kitchen lights, a brass reminder that he'd followed the family tradition of serving and protecting, just in a different uniform. His service weapon sat holstered at his hip, a Glock 17 that he'd probably drawn more times in 1 year of police work than I'd drawn my rifle in 2 combat deployments. He'd always been the golden child, the one who'd never questioned orders, who'd graduated from the police academy with highest honors, who'd made detective in 3 years. Everything came easy to Jake. The physical training, the authority, the unquestioning obedience that our father valued above all else. When Dad told him to jump, Jake would ask how high before his feet left the ground. When someone needed to be stopped, Jake stopped them. When a target needed to be neutralized, Jake neutralized it. He was everything I'd failed to become, and we all knew it. "Heard you made Sergeant First Class," Jake said without looking up from his mashed potatoes. His voice carried the same flat affect as our father's, but underneath I caught something else. Relief, maybe, that he didn't have to explain his sister the perpetual private anymore. Or maybe disappointment that even my promotion couldn't erase what I'd done. Congratulations! The word hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, acrid and bitter. I stayed standing. 5 years in the infantry had taught me to read terrain faster than most people could blink, and this room was hostile territory. The empty chair at the table, my old spot between Mom and Jake, might as well have been surrounded by landmines. The family photos on the walls told the story of my absence. Jake's police academy graduation, his wedding to his high school sweetheart, their first child. My deployment photos conspicuously absent, as if the army had swallowed me whole and never spit me back out. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away seconds that felt like hours. I'd faced down Taliban fighters with more warmth than I was getting from my own family. Enemy combatants who'd at least had the courtesy to acknowledge my existence before trying to kill me. "I came to tell you something," I said, keeping my voice steady. Military bearing, they called it in basic training. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. Even when your drill sergeant was screaming in your face. Even when your commanding officer was questioning your courage. Even when your own family looked at you like you were contaminated. Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Hope, maybe, that I'd finally come home with news that would make him proud. That his daughter had finally become the soldier he'd always wanted her to be. "Let me guess," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "Another medal for not doing your job?" The words hit like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. Couldn't flinch. Not anymore. I'd learned to absorb impacts, physical and emotional, the way Kevlar absorbed bullets. Feel the force. Distribute the energy. Keep moving forward. He was referring to Afghanistan, to the incident that had followed me home like a shadow, whispered about in mess halls and briefing rooms, from Fort Bragg to Kandahar. The day I'd disobeyed a direct order from my commanding officer and refused to engage a target. The day that had cost me a promotion, earned me a reputation, and changed everything I thought I knew about what it meant to be a soldier. The day that had made me a pariah in my own family. Jake looked up for the first time since I'd walked in, his brown eyes, Dad's eyes, hard and unforgiving. Still refusing to talk about what really happened over there? I met his gaze steadily. "You never asked what really happened. You just assumed I screwed up." "Because you did screw up," he shot back. "You had a clear shot at an enemy combatant, and you choked. You endangered your entire squad because you went soft when it mattered most." The story had made its way through the veteran networks, distorted and simplified until it bore no resemblance to the truth. Sarah Henderson, the medic who'd frozen under fire, the girl who'd let her emotions override her training, the soldier who'd put enemy lives above American ones. None of them knew what I'd actually seen through that scope. None of them had been there in the dust and heat and chaos of that moment when everything hung in the balance and I'd had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. "The president wants to see me next month," I said quietly. The room went dead silent. Mom's fork clattered against her plate as her hand started shaking. Jake's chair creaked as he leaned back, his face going pale. Even Dad's military composure cracked for just a second, his eyes widening before he could catch himself. "For what?" Mom whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. I reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the weight of the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 days now. Ever since Captain Morrison had called me into his office with that expression on his face, the one that said either your career is over or something extraordinary is about to happen. The envelope had been sitting on his desk like a loaded weapon, presidential seal embossed in gold, My name written in script that belonged in history books. I pulled it out slowly, feeling their eyes on me like laser sights. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind reserved for moments that changed lives and rewrote family legacies. The kind that turned cowards into heroes and failures into legends. The Medal of Honor, I said. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Outside, thunder rolled across the Nebraska plains like distant artillery, but inside the kitchen, you could have heard a pin drop on carpet 3 rooms away. Jake's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly, his face flushed red. That's impossible. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. My voice was calm, almost conversational, the way it got when I was treating a wounded soldier under fire. Clinical. Detached. Professional. Because cowards don't get medals? Because you refuse to fight. The words exploded out of him like he'd been holding them back for years, like a dam finally bursting under pressure. You had a clear shot at an insurgent and you let him walk away. You put your entire unit at risk because you couldn't pull the damn trigger when it counted. I nodded slowly, feeling something settle in my chest, a weight I'd been carrying for 5 years, finally finding its proper place. You're right, I did refuse to shoot. Dad's hands were flat on the table now, knuckles white against the dark wood. His wedding ring clicked against his water glass as his fingers drummed in unconscious rhythm. The same nervous habit he'd had before every deployment, every difficult conversation, every moment when his carefully ordered world threatened to tilt off its axis. Then how? He started. Because the quote, enemy combatant was a 12-year-old boy carrying medical supplies to his wounded father, I said, my voice cutting through the storm of their disbelief like a blade. Because what looked like an AK-47 from 300 meters away was actually bandages and antibiotics wrapped in a canvas bag. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't pulling a trigger. It's refusing to pull it when everyone around you is screaming for blood. The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Heavier, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Mom had stopped eating entirely, her plate forgotten as she stared at me like she was seeing her daughter for the first time in years. Jake sank back into his chair like I'd punched him in the stomach, all the fight draining out of him at once. The Taliban fighters who were actually in that compound used the boy as bait, I continued, pulling out another document from my jacket. The after-action report I'd never shown them, never talked about, never defended myself with, because I'd thought the truth would speak for itself. They knew American forces would spot a small figure moving between buildings and assume hostile intent. They were counting on us being so focused on the easy target that we'd miss the real ambush they were setting up in the tree line behind us. I unfolded the papers, seeing my commanding officer's signature at the bottom, the same Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez who'd screamed at me over the radio that day, calling me everything but a soldier, the same man who'd written this report 3 months later. After the intelligence came in, after the full picture emerged, after he'd realized that his medic's moment of hesitation had saved his entire platoon. When I refused to engage, it forced my squad to reassess the situation, I read aloud. Instead of rushing forward to neutralize what appeared to be a lone insurgent, we held position and called for surveillance support. Drone footage revealed 12 Taliban fighters positioned in an L-shaped ambush, waiting for us to expose ourselves while pursuing the decoy. Dad was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language, his world of absolute authority and unquestioning obedience crumbling right there on his kitchen table. The boy was Ahmed Naziri, age 12, son of a village elder who'd been wounded by an IED while trying to clear the road for a medical convoy, I continued. The supplies he was carrying were donated by American forces to treat civilian casualties. If I'd pulled that trigger, I trailed off, letting them imagine the headlines. The international incident, the funeral of a child who'd been trying to save his father's life. Instead, we repositioned and called in air support. 2 A-10s neutralized the ambush without civilian casualties. Saved 14 American lives and 37 Afghan civilians, including Ahmed and his father. I folded the report and put it back in my pocket, along with the letter from the president that had started this whole conversation. The paper felt lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because the burden of carrying this truth alone was finally being shared. "You never told us any of this," Mom said, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. There were tears in her eyes now, the first real emotion I'd seen from her since I'd walked in. "You never asked," I replied. "When the news came back about the incident, you assumed I'd failed. When the investigation started, you assumed I was guilty. When I got passed over for promotion, you assumed I deserved it. You never once asked for my side of the story." The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, each tone echoing through the house like a funeral bell. Growing up, that sound had meant bedtime, homework, the end of another day in the Henderson household, where military precision governed everything from dinner conversation to weekend chores. Now it sounded like time running out, like chances slipping away, like a family that had forgotten how to talk to each other finally running out of silence to hide behind. "The promotion board reviewed my case last year," I said, reaching for the final document in my jacket. "Along with testimony from every member of my squad, satellite footage from the engagement, and intelligence reports from Afghan sources. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez recommended me for the Silver Star. The review board upgraded it to the Distinguished Service Cross. The Secretary of the Army upgraded it to the Medal of Honor." Jake was shaking his head, his world of black and white certainties crumbling around him. "But you disobeyed orders." "I prevented a war crime," I corrected. "There's a difference." Dad's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Why didn't you defend yourself when it happened? Why did you let us think?" "Because I thought you knew me better than that," I said simply. "I thought my own family would give me the benefit of the doubt. I thought after 25 years of being your daughter, you'd trust that I might have had a good reason for doing what I did." The storm outside was finally passing, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening from a hammer blow to a gentle patter against the windows. But the storm in this kitchen was just beginning. "I didn't come here for an apology," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I didn't come here to relitigate the past or demand recognition for something I did 5 years ago. I came to tell you that everything you taught me about courage was wrong." Dad flinched like I'd slapped him. "You taught me that courage meant following orders without question, that a good soldier shoots first and asks questions later, that hesitation is weakness and mercy is failure." I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of my uniform, the significance of the moment. But real courage isn't about being the fastest to pull a trigger. It's about being strong enough not to pull it when you know it's wrong. It's about choosing to be right instead of choosing to be safe. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the fields where I'd learned to shoot, where I'd proven I could hit any target Dad set up for me. The same fields where he'd taught me that the world was divided into threats and non-threats, enemies and allies, targets and civilians. A simple world where every problem had a tactical solution and every question had a military answer. "Ahmed Naziri is 18 now," I said without turning around. "He's studying to be a doctor, wants to join Doctors Without Borders. Says he wants to help people the way the American soldiers helped his father. He wrote me a letter last year, thanking me for not shooting him that day." I turned back to face them, seeing my family clearly for the first time in years. Dad, the retired colonel who'd built his identity around absolute authority and unquestioning obedience. Mom, the Army wife who'd learned to support her husband's decisions even when they broke her heart. Jake, the small-town cop who'd inherited Dad's certainty about right and wrong, good and evil, us and them. And me, the daughter who'd learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to be what everyone expects you to be. "The ceremony is in 3 weeks," I said, pulling on my jacket. "You're invited, all of you. But I understand if you can't make it. Some people prefer their heroes to fit in neat little boxes, and I've never been very good at that." I walked toward the door, my boots echoing on the linoleum one last time. Behind me, I heard Mom's chair scrape back. Heard her whisper something to Dad that I couldn't quite catch. Heard Jake curse under his breath and slam his hand against the table. "Sarah, wait," Dad called out, his voice cracking on my name. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, looking back at the man who taught me to shoot, to march, to salute, to follow orders without question. The man who'd raised me to be a soldier but had never taught me how to be human. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. For a moment, I felt like that 8-year-old girl again, hitting my first bullseye at 200 meters, hearing my father's approval for the first time in my life. For a moment, it was enough. But only for a moment. "I know," I said, "but you should have been proud of me 5 years ago, when I made the hardest decision of my life and stood by it even when it cost me everything. You should have been proud of me for being your daughter, not for winning a medal that proved I was right." The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached my truck, but I could still hear the storm inside the house behind me. Voices raised in argument, questions finally being asked, assumptions finally being challenged. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking back at the farmhouse where I'd learned everything I'd had to unlearn to become the soldier I was meant to be. The place where I'd been taught that strength meant never backing down, and courage meant never showing weakness. They'd spent 5 years thinking they'd raised a coward. In 3 weeks, when the President of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around my neck in front of a room full of generals and politicians and journalists, they'd finally understand the truth. They hadn't raised a coward. They'd raised a hero who'd learned the difference between the two. 3 days after the confrontation at the farm, I was sitting in my apartment at Fort Riley, staring at a manila envelope that had arrived with no return address. My name was written in block letters across the front. Sergeant Sarah Henderson. Personal and confidential. The postmark was from Washington, D.C., but that told me nothing. Half my correspondence these days came from the Pentagon, the White House staff coordinating the Medal of Honor ceremony, or journalists trying to get an exclusive interview about the hero medic of Afghanistan. I'd been avoiding most of the calls. The story they wanted to tell wasn't the story that needed telling, and I'd learned the hard way that the truth and the narrative rarely lined up in military public relations. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Jake's name flashed on the screen, the third time he'd called since I'd left the farm. I let it go to voicemail like the others. Whatever he wanted to say could wait until I was ready to hear it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of what looked like an old military document, partially redacted with thick black lines. At the top, in faded typeface, I could make out, "Classified, Operation Mountain Resolve After Action Report." My blood ran cold. Operation Mountain Resolve had been the name of our deployment to Afghanistan, the one where the incident with Ahmed had happened. But this document was dated 6 months before that day, and the classification level was higher than anything a sergeant first class would normally have access to. Most of the text was blacked out, but fragments remained visible. Intelligence indicates Taliban forces have developed new tactics involving civilian decoys. Specific training protocols must be implemented to prevent American forces from falling into ambush scenarios. Recommend immediate dissemination to all forward operating bases regarding identification of false flag operations. At the bottom of the page, barely legible through the poor photocopy quality, was a signature block. Lieutenant Colonel Elena Rodriguez, Intelligence Officer, Combined Joint Task Force. My commanding officer. The woman who'd screamed at me over the radio that day, who'd called me a coward for refusing to engage. The same woman who'd later written my commendation when the truth came out. But according to this document, she'd known about the Taliban's use of child decoys months before our encounter with Ahmed. She'd known, and somehow that knowledge had never made it down to the soldiers who needed it most. I reached for my laptop and started typing an email, then stopped. If this document was authentic, and the sick feeling in my stomach suggested it was, then someone had deliberately withheld intelligence that could have prevented exactly the kind of situation I'd found myself in. Someone had let me walk into that ambush blind, forced me to make an impossible choice, and then allowed me to be crucified for making the right one. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Jake. It was a number I didn't recognize, with a DC area code. Sergeant Henderson? The voice was female, professional, careful. Yes. My name is Captain Jennifer Walsh. I'm with the Army Criminal Investigation Command. I understand you received some materials today that might be of interest to both of us. I stared at the document on my coffee table. How did you? I sent them, she said quietly, and I think we need to talk. Captain Walsh looked exactly like what central casting would order for a military investigator. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd seen enough corruption to fill a small war. We met at a coffee shop in Junction City, far enough from Fort Riley to avoid curious eyes, but close enough that I could drive back if this turned out to be some kind of setup. She slid into the booth across from me, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly pay. The kind of accessory that suggested she'd either been promoted fast or had connections outside the normal military hierarchy. "Thank you for coming," she said, ordering black coffee when the waitress approached. "I know this is irregular." "Irregular is one word for it," I replied. "Potentially career-ending is another." She smiled grimly. "Your career isn't the one in danger here, Sergeant. At least, not if you're willing to help me understand what really happened in Afghanistan." I studied her face, looking for tells. 5 years in the infantry had taught me to read people under stress, and Captain Walsh was definitely under stress. Her hands were steady, but there was tension around her eyes, the kind that came from not sleeping well for weeks. "You first," I said. "Who are you really, and how did you get access to classified documents from my deployment?" She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "I'm exactly who I said I am, CID. Assigned to investigate irregularities in intelligence dissemination during Operation Mountain Resolve. What I didn't mention is that your case isn't the only one we're looking at." She slid a photograph across the table. It showed a young soldier in ACUs, maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of earnest expression that screamed, "small-town kid on his first deployment." Private First Class Michael Torres, 2nd Infantry Division, KIA, Afghanistan, 18 months ago, shot and killed what he believed to be an armed insurgent during a patrol in Kandahar province. I looked at the photo, then back at Walsh. "Let me guess, it was a kid with medical supplies." 14-year-old girl carrying water and bandages to wounded civilians after a marketplace bombing. Torres followed standard rules of engagement, saw someone moving between buildings with what appeared to be suspicious packages, and engaged the target. She pulled out another photo, this one grainier, taken from a distance. The Taliban had been using the bombing as cover to set up an ambush. They wanted American forces to pursue what they thought was a fleeing insurgent right into a kill zone. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. But Torres took the shot. Killed the girl, exposed his position, and walked his entire squad into the ambush exactly as planned. 7 Americans dead, including Torres. The Taliban melted away before reinforcements could arrive. I felt sick. And the intelligence about false flag operations? Was sitting in a classified database that required clearance levels most field commanders didn't have. The information existed, but it never made it to the soldiers who needed it. Walsh leaned forward. "Except in your case." "What do you mean?" "You were supposed to take that shot, Sergeant. You were supposed to kill Ahmed Naziri, expose your position, and lead your squad into the same kind of ambush that killed Torres and his men. The Taliban had perfect intelligence about American patrol routes, knew exactly where you'd be and when. They had the ambush site prepared, weapons positioned, escape routes planned." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. I could hear my own heartbeat over the ambient noise of conversations and clinking dishes. "But I didn't take the shot." "No, you didn't." And that decision, that split-second moment of hesitation that everyone called cowardice, disrupted their entire operation. Instead of rushing forward to pursue a fleeing target, your squad held position. Instead of walking into a kill zone, you called for air support. Instead of 7 dead Americans, we got 12 dead Taliban fighters and a tactical victory that the Pentagon is still studying. She pulled out a third document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. The Taliban commander who planned that ambush was captured 3 months later. During interrogation, he specifically mentioned the American female soldier who, quote, refused to kill the boy and how it destroyed months of preparation. I stared at the papers scattered across the coffee shop table, feeling like I was looking at my life from the outside. The incident that had defined my career, that had made me a pariah in my own family, that had nearly cost me everything I'd worked for, it had all been part of someone else's plan. "Who knew?" I asked quietly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Walsh gathered the documents back into her briefcase. The intelligence about Taliban tactics was real, but it was compartmentalized at a level that kept it from reaching the people who needed it most. Someone made decisions about who got access to life-saving information and who didn't. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez knew. The document you sent me proves that. Rodriguez knew about the tactics in general, but she claims she never received specific intelligence about your patrol. According to her, the information about child decoys was theoretical, something to be aware of, not something actively being used in your area of operations. I thought back to that day, to the chaos and confusion, and the voice on the radio screaming at me to take the shot. Rodriguez had been furious, genuinely furious, not the kind of anger you fake for the sake of appearances. If she'd known what was really happening, if she'd understood that my hesitation was saving lives instead of costing them. She didn't know, I said. Not about the specific ambush. She was as surprised as anyone when the intelligence came in later. Which means someone higher up the chain made the decision to withhold that information. Someone who knew that American soldiers were walking into traps and chose not to warn them. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How many others? That's what I'm trying to find out. Torres was just the first case I could document. There have been at least 6 similar incidents over the past 2 years. American forces engaging what they believed to be legitimate targets, only to discover later that they'd been manipulated into tactical disadvantages. And I was supposed to be number 7. Except you didn't follow the script. You made a decision that no one expected, disrupted a carefully laid plan, and saved lives that were supposed to be lost. Walsh closed her briefcase and leaned back in the booth. The question is, are you willing to help me figure out who was writing that script? The drive back to Fort Riley took 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to process everything Walsh had told me, trying to fit it into the narrative I'd been living with for 5 years. I'd thought the hardest part was over, proving that I'd made the right choice, earning the recognition that had been withheld, finally getting my family to understand that their daughter wasn't a coward. But this was bigger than my family's approval, or even my own vindication. If Walsh was right, then American soldiers were dying, because someone in the chain of command was playing games with intelligence, treating human lives like pieces on a chessboard. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment building. Jake's name flashed on the screen again, and this time I answered. Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. I've been busy. What do you want, Jake? I want to apologize. His voice was rough, like he'd been drinking or hadn't slept. Dad told me what happened after you left the other night. About the argument, about Mom crying, about how we treated you. I sat in my truck with the engine running, listening to my brother's voice crack with something that might have been genuine remorse. It's a little late for apologies. I know we screwed up. But Sarah, there's something else. Something I should have told you years ago, but I didn't know how. What are you talking about? Remember when you first came back from Afghanistan? When the rumors started about what happened over there? He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. I got a call from someone. Military police, he said, but the call came through civilian channels. He told me that you were under investigation for cowardice under fire, that the family should distance ourselves from you until the matter was resolved. My blood went cold. Someone called you? He said it was unofficial, off the record. Said that your case was going to be reviewed, and that it would be better for everyone if we didn't appear to be supporting someone who might be court-martialed for failing in combat. And you believed him. We didn't know what to believe. You wouldn't talk about what happened, wouldn't defend yourself. This guy sounded official. Knew details about your deployment that weren't public knowledge. He said he was looking out for the family, trying to give us a heads up before the story broke. I thought about Captain Walsh's investigation, about the pattern of manipulation she was uncovering, about intelligence being withheld and soldiers being set up to fail, about someone pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating events for reasons I didn't understand yet. What was his name? I asked. I don't remember. Something military sounding. Colonel Crawford? No, Crawley. Colonel Crawley. He said he worked in personnel management, knew Dad from the old days. I'd never heard the name, but that didn't mean anything. The Army was full of colonels, and personnel management covered a lot of ground. But the timing was suspicious. Someone calling my family right when I needed their support most, feeding them information that would turn them against me. Jake, I need you to think carefully. Did this Colonel Crawley say anything else? Anything about why he was calling, who he was working for? He said that there were going to be questions about your judgment, about whether you were fit for continued service. He suggested that the family should prepare for the possibility that you might be discharged, that we should be ready to help you transition to civilian life. Someone had been playing a long game, manipulating not just the intelligence that reached combat units, but the support systems that kept soldiers functional when they came home. They'd turned my family against me, isolated me, made sure I had nowhere to go when the pressure mounted. Sarah, what's going on? You sound scared. I looked at my apartment building, at the windows of my unit on the 3rd floor. For the first time since I'd moved off base, it felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone might be watching. I can't explain everything right now, but Jake, I need you to do something for me. I need you to find out everything you can about that phone call. Check your phone records if you still have them, try to remember any other details, and don't tell anyone we had this conversation. You're scaring me. Good, because I'm scared too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the building, every car that passed on the street below. Captain Walsh's investigation had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, but it was too late to close it now. At 0300, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Package on your doorstep. Come alone. I grabbed my service weapon from the nightstand and moved to the front window. The hallway was empty, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh shadows. On the floor outside my door was a manila envelope, identical to the one I'd received 3 days earlier. I waited 10 minutes, watching for any sign of movement, before opening the door. The envelope was heavier this time, stuffed with documents and photographs. No return address, no postmark. Someone had delivered it by hand. Back inside, I spread the contents across my kitchen table. More classified documents, these ones even more heavily redacted. Personnel files with names blacked out. Financial records from defense contractors. Communication logs between various military installations. And at the bottom of the stack, a photograph that made my hands shake. It showed a conference room full of men in military uniforms and business suits. The image was grainy, taken from a distance or with a hidden camera, but I could make out enough details to understand what I was looking at. Charts on the walls showing casualty projections. Maps of Afghanistan with tactical overlays. A presentation screen displaying what looked like cost-benefit analyses. In the center of the table was a document I could barely read, but the header was clear enough. Operation Acceptable Losses, Phase 3 Implementation. One of the men in suits was pointing at something on the map, speaking to a group of officers who were taking notes. I couldn't make out faces clearly, but the body language was unmistakable. This was a briefing, a planning session, a meeting where decisions were being made. Decisions about acceptable losses, about which soldiers would live and which would die, about how many American casualties were worth whatever strategic objective they were pursuing. My phone rang, jarring me out of my horrified fascination with the photograph. Unknown number again. Did you get my delivery? The voice was digitally distorted, robotic, impossible to identify. Who is this? Someone who knows that you're asking the right questions. Someone who's been waiting for a soldier like you, one with enough courage to refuse orders when those orders are wrong. What do you want? I want to stop them. The people in that photograph, the ones who've been treating American soldiers like expendable resources. They've been running an operation for 3 years now, deliberately putting combat units in harm's way to test new tactics, gather intelligence, and justify budget increases. I stared at the photograph, at the men in suits who looked like they were discussing quarterly earnings instead of human lives. Acceptable losses. Every soldier who's died because intelligence was withheld, every squad that's walked into an ambush that could have been prevented, every family that's gotten a folded flag instead of their child, they're all acceptable losses in service of a larger strategy. What strategy? Prolonged engagement. The longer the war continues, the more money flows to defense contractors, the more power accumulates in certain hands, the more justification exists for expanding military presence in the region. Peace is bad for business, Sergeant. Quick victories don't generate sustainable revenue streams. The voice was clinical, matter of fact, describing mass murder like it was an accounting problem. But underneath the digital distortion, I could hear something else. Anger, maybe, or grief. This wasn't just an informant passing along classified information. This was someone with personal stakes in the game. Why me? Why are you telling me this? Because you're about to receive the Medal of Honor for doing exactly what they didn't want you to do. Thinking for yourself, refusing to follow orders that would have gotten people killed, disrupting their carefully laid plans. You're going to be standing in the White House in 2 weeks, being celebrated for the exact kind of behavior they've been trying to eliminate from the military. And you want me to do something about it. I want you to understand what you're really being honored for. You didn't just save some lives in Afghanistan, Sergeant Henderson. You exposed a flaw in their system. You proved that soldiers with consciences are harder to manipulate than soldiers who follow orders blindly. The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear what sounded like papers shuffling, someone organizing documents. There's going to be another test soon. Another squad, another ambush, another opportunity for acceptable losses. The difference is, this time you'll know it's coming. Where? When? The details are in the envelope. Everything you need to prevent another Torres, another 7 dead Americans walking into a trap because someone decided their lives were worth less than the strategic objective. I looked at the documents scattered across my table, at the photograph of men in suits planning the deaths of soldiers they'd never meet, at the evidence of a conspiracy that reached higher into the military hierarchy than I'd ever imagined. What happens if I say no? If I decide this is too big for one sergeant to handle? Then in 6 months, you'll read about another tragic loss of American heroes in Afghanistan. Another group of families getting bad news. Another set of acceptable losses in service of the greater good. The voice paused. And you'll know that you could have stopped it. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen until dawn, reading through the documents, studying the photograph, trying to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. The Medal of Honor ceremony that had seemed like the culmination of my vindication was starting to feel like the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Your father wants to drive up to see you. Says he has things to say that can't wait for the ceremony. Is that okay? I looked at the evidence spread across my table, at the proof that the military I'd devoted my life to serving was being used as a testing ground for strategies that treated soldiers like laboratory rats, at the photograph of men in suits who'd never worn a uniform deciding which of us were acceptable losses. Yes, I texted back. Tell him to come. We have a lot to talk about. Quote. But first, I had a call to make. Captain Walsh had asked if I was willing to help her investigate the intelligence failures that had cost American lives. Now I knew the answer. This wasn't just about intelligence failures. This was about systematic manipulation, deliberate endangerment, and acceptable losses that were anything but acceptable. And in 2 weeks, when I stood in front of the President of the United States receiving the nation's highest honor for military valor, I was going to have to decide whether to smile for the cameras or tell the world what that honor really represented. The medal was supposed to be for courage under fire. I was about to find out just how much courage I really had. My father arrived at Fort Riley 3 days before the Medal of Honor ceremony, driving his old Ford pickup truck the same way he'd driven Humvees in Iraq, with military precision and barely contained aggression. I watched from my apartment window as he parked in the visitor's lot below, his movements sharp and economical as he grabbed a duffel bag from the truck bed. Even in civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, he carried himself like he was still wearing stars on his collar. Colonel Marcus Henderson, Rhett, had never made social visits. When he traveled, it was for a reason, with an objective, and with a plan to accomplish both as efficiently as possible. The fact that he'd driven 4 hours from Nebraska without calling first meant something had changed in the 3 days since I'd left the farm, with his grudging admission of pride still echoing in the kitchen. I met him at the building's main entrance, noting how his eyes automatically swept the area, checking sight lines, identifying potential threats, cataloging escape routes. 28 years in the Army didn't leave your system just because you'd turned in your uniform. Dad? I nodded, keeping my voice neutral. Sarah? He hefted his duffel bag. You got somewhere we can talk? Somewhere private? I led him upstairs to my apartment, a modest 2-bedroom unit that reflected both my military salary and my minimalist lifestyle. The walls were bare except for a few photographs from my deployments and a certificate of completion from Ranger School. The furniture was functional, utilitarian, designed for someone who might have to pack up and move to a new assignment with minimal notice. Dad set his bag down near the door and looked around, taking inventory the same way he'd inspected barracks during his command years. His gaze lingered on the dining table, where I'd hastily gathered up the classified documents from Captain Walsh's investigation, stacking them in what I hoped looked like ordinary paperwork. Coffee? I offered. This isn't a social call. He sat down heavily on my couch, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I need to tell you some things. Things I should have said years ago, but I was too proud and too stupid to admit I was wrong. I remained standing, maintaining tactical advantage through positioning, another lesson he'd taught me, though I doubted he'd intended for me to use it against him. I'm listening. Quote, after you left the other night, your mother and I had a long talk. First real conversation we'd had in years, maybe decades. About you? About the family, about choices we made that we can't take back. He ran his hands through his gray hair, a gesture I remembered from my childhood when he was wrestling with difficult decisions. She made me realize that we didn't just fail you as parents, we failed you as Americans. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a discharged weapon. I'd expected an apology, maybe some awkward attempt at reconciliation. I hadn't expected a confession. What do you mean? I mean, we taught you to be a soldier, but we forgot to teach you to be a human being. We told you that following orders was the highest virtue, that questioning authority was weakness, that the military was always right because it was the military. He looked up at me, his eyes reflecting something I'd never seen there before. Doubt. We turned you into exactly the kind of soldier this country needs, and then we punished you for being her. I sat down across from him, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. Dad? Let me finish, please. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used during mission briefings when the stakes were highest. Jake told me about the phone call, about Colonel Crawley, about someone warning the family away from you right when you needed us most. My pulse quickened. What about it? I've been making some calls, calling in favors, reaching out to old contacts, trying to track down this Crawley character. His expression darkened. There's no Colonel Crawley in personnel management. Never has been. The call came from someone using a fake identity, someone who knew enough about military protocol to sound convincing but not enough to fool someone who actually worked in the system. The implications hit me like incoming artillery. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my relationship with my family, isolated me from my support system, made sure I had nowhere to turn when the pressure mounted. It was psychological warfare, and they'd used my own father's military conditioning against him. Who would do that? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I already knew the answer. Someone who wanted you discredited, marginalized, pushed out of the service before you could cause problems. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base beyond. Someone who knew that a soldier with a conscience and the courage to use it was dangerous to whatever they were planning. I thought about the documents hidden in my bedroom, about Captain Walsh's investigation, about the anonymous caller who'd warned me about acceptable losses in Operation Mountain Resolve, about the photograph showing men in suits planning the deaths of soldiers they'd never meet. Dad, what if I told you that the phone call was just the beginning? What if there was something bigger going on? Something that involved using American soldiers as expendable assets in some kind of larger strategy? He turned back to me, his expression grim. I'd say that's exactly what I'm afraid of. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Captain Walsh's number flashed on the screen. I need to take this, I told him. Sergeant Henderson? Walsh's voice was tight with urgency. We have a problem. The operation I mentioned. The one where another squad is being set up. It's happening tonight. My blood went cold. Where? Forward Operating Base Keating, Afghanistan. 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment. They're being sent on a patrol that our intelligence indicates will lead them directly into a prepared ambush. I looked at my father, who was watching me with the focused attention of someone who recognized a crisis briefing when he heard one. Can you stop it? Not through official channels. The orders have already been cut, the patrol briefed. If I try to intervene directly, I'll blow the entire investigation and alert whoever's behind this that we're onto them. Then what do you want me to do? I want you to make a choice, Sergeant. You can let this happen and focus on the ceremony, on getting your medal and your vindication. Or you can risk everything to save 14 soldiers who don't even know they're walking into a trap. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders like a rucksack full of lead. In 48 hours, I was supposed to be standing in the White House receiving the nation's highest honor for military valor. The vindication I'd fought for, the proof that I'd been right all along, the moment that would restore my reputation and prove to my family that their daughter wasn't a coward. But 14 soldiers were about to die because someone had decided their lives were acceptable losses in service of a larger strategy. What do you need me to do? I need you to contact them directly. Soldier to soldier, not through official channels. You have credibility in the combat community now, the Medal of Honor recipient who saved lives by refusing to follow orders. If anyone can convince them to abort the mission, it's you. I looked at my father, who was listening to my side of the conversation with growing alarm. I'll need communications equipment, probably satellite uplink to reach Afghanistan. And I'll need someone to cover for me if this goes sideways. I can handle the communications. But Sarah, if you do this, if you interfere with active military operations, they'll court-martial you. Medal of Honor or not, they'll destroy your career and probably put you in prison. Then I guess I better make sure it works. 3 hours later, I was sitting in an unmarked van parked outside a communications facility near Fort Leavenworth, surrounded by equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Captain Walsh had called in favors of her own, apparently because the van was staffed by 2 technical specialists who'd introduced themselves with first names only and refused to make eye contact. My father sat in the passenger seat, having insisted on coming along despite my protests. "You're going to need backup," he'd said with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "And I owe you about 20 years of support." The satellite connection crackled to life, and suddenly I was looking at a grainy video feed from a computer screen halfway around the world. A young sergeant with tired eyes and desert camouflage was staring back at me, confusion written across his face. "Sergeant Henderson? Ma'am, I don't understand. Why are you calling us?" "Sergeant Martinez, right? 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company?" "Yes, ma'am, but..." "I need you to listen to me very carefully. In approximately 6 hours, you're scheduled to begin a patrol to grid coordinates that I'm going to give you. I need you to abort that mission." His confusion deepened. "Ma'am, with respect, you're not in my chain of command. I can't just abort a mission because a Medal of Honor recipient who's been where you are told you that you're walking into a trap?" I leaned closer to the camera. "Sergeant, I'm the soldier who refused to shoot a kid in Afghanistan 5 years ago. You've probably heard the story." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "The medic who saved her squad by disobeying orders." "That's right, and I'm calling you now because the same people who set up that ambush are setting up another one. The coordinates you've been given will lead you directly into a prepared killing zone where Taliban fighters are waiting with heavy weapons and mortars." "How do you know that?" I looked at Captain Walsh, who nodded grimly. "Because we've been tracking a pattern of intelligence manipulation that's been getting American soldiers killed. Someone in the chain of command has been withholding information that could save lives, forcing combat units into situations where they'll take casualties." Sergeant Martinez was silent for a long moment, probably processing the implications of what I was telling him. In the background, I could see other soldiers moving around what looked like a command tent, going about their pre-mission preparations. "Ma'am, even if what you're saying is true, I can't just refuse orders. Your commanding officer doesn't know he's sending you to die. The intelligence briefing he received was incomplete, designed to make the mission look routine when it's actually a death trap." On the screen, Martinez turned to someone off camera and had a whispered conversation I couldn't make out, When he turned back, his expression was grim. "Lieutenant Sullivan wants to speak with you." A moment later, a young officer appeared on screen, probably mid-20s, with the kind of earnest determination that reminded me of myself at that age. "Sergeant Henderson, this is Lieutenant Sullivan. I appreciate your concern, but I have my orders. We have a mission to complete." "Lieutenant, how many soldiers have you lost to IEDs in the past 6 months?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question. 3. "But I don't see how that's relevant. How many of those IEDs were placed along routes that intelligence said were clear?" His silence was answer enough. "Someone has been feeding your command incomplete information, Lieutenant. Routes that should have been marked as high risk were reported as safe. Patrol areas that should have been avoided were designated as priority targets. And tonight, you're being sent to coordinates where Taliban fighters have been preparing an ambush for the past week. You can't possibly know that." Quote. I looked at Captain Walsh again, who slid a photograph across to me, satellite imagery showing the patrol route and the ambush positions. "Lieutenant, I'm going to describe exactly what you'll find when you reach the target area. There will be a dried riverbed running east-west about 500 meters from your objective. The Taliban have positioned mortars on the high ground to the north, with interlocking fields of fire covering the entire approach route. They've been using civilian buildings as cover, which is why air reconnaissance hasn't spotted them." Lieutenant Sullivan's face went pale. "How do you?" "Because the same tactics were used against my squad 5 years ago. The only difference is I refused to follow the script." I leaned closer to the camera. "Lieutenant, in your briefing materials, there should be a reference to potential civilian activity in the area. Something about shepherds or farmers who might be moving through the region." He turned away from the camera, and I could hear papers rustling. When he came back, his expression had changed completely. "The briefing mentions possible non-combatant movement along the riverbed. We're supposed to be prepared for visual contact with civilians." "Those aren't civilians, Lieutenant. They're spotters, positioned to report your movement to the mortar teams. The moment you enter the target area, they'll call in coordinates, and you'll be walking into a barrage that will pin you down while the Taliban close in from 3 sides." The young officer was quiet for a long moment, probably weighing the career implications of trusting a sergeant he'd never met against the possibility that 14 of his soldiers might die if he was wrong. "What do you want me to do?" The next 4 hours passed in a blur of encrypted communications, hastily revised mission parameters, and carefully orchestrated deception. Lieutenant Sullivan proved to be both resourceful and courageous, willing to risk his career to protect his soldiers while maintaining the appearance of following orders. Instead of proceeding to the ambush site, his platoon would conduct what appeared to be a routine patrol of a different area, one that would place them in position to observe the Taliban positions without exposing themselves to fire. Meanwhile, Captain Walsh worked her contacts in military intelligence to arrange for unscheduled air reconnaissance of the original target area. At 0347 Afghanistan time, the pieces came together. "Sergeant Henderson?" Lieutenant Sullivan's voice crackled through the communication equipment. "You were right. Drone footage shows at least 15 Taliban fighters in prepared positions, exactly where you said they'd be. Mortars, heavy machine guns, and what looks like RPG teams positioned to cover all the approach routes." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a deeper concern. If the ambush had been set as perfectly as described, it meant someone with access to classified intelligence had been feeding information to the Taliban. Someone in the American command structure was actively collaborating with enemy forces. "Lieutenant, I need you to document everything. Photographs, video, precise coordinates of the enemy positions. This information is going to be crucial for an ongoing investigation." "Already on it, ma'am. But I have to ask, what happens now? My command is going to want to know why we didn't complete the original mission." I looked at Captain Walsh, who had been coordinating with her superiors throughout the night. She nodded grimly. "Tell them you received last-minute intelligence indicating possible civilian casualties if you proceeded as planned. Tell them you made a tactical decision to reposition for better observation. And Lieutenant?" "Yes, ma'am?" "In about 6 hours, there's going to be a lot of very angry people demanding to know how their carefully planned ambush got disrupted. Be prepared for some difficult questions." The connection ended, leaving the van in relative silence, broken only by the hum of electronic equipment. Outside, dawn was breaking over Kansas, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of sunrises in Afghanistan. My father, who had listened to the entire exchange without comment, finally spoke. "You just saved 14 lives." "Maybe." I rubbed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion of a sleepless night. "But we also just declared war on whoever's been orchestrating these operations." Captain Walsh was already packing up the communication equipment. "The ceremony is tomorrow night. Are you still planning to attend?" It was a loaded question. By now, word of the night's activities would be filtering up through various chains of command. Someone would connect my unauthorized communication with Lieutenant Sullivan's decision to abort his mission. They'd realize that their carefully planned ambush had been disrupted by outside interference. "I'll be there," I said. "But I don't think it's going to go the way anyone expects." The White House East Room had been transformed into something that looked like a movie set. Flags, formal portraits, enough gold braid and dress uniforms to outfit a small army. I stood in the corridor outside, wearing my dress blue uniform with the ribbons and badges that told the story of my military career, waiting for the ceremony to begin. My family was seated in the front row, Dad in his old dress uniform, looking proud and terrified in equal measure, Mom in a navy dress that she'd probably bought specifically for the occasion, Jake in his police dress uniform, his expression unreadable. They'd driven up from Nebraska that morning, and we'd had barely 10 minutes to talk before the White House staff had whisked me away for final preparations. But they were here. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of silence and misunderstanding, they were here. Captain Walsh stood near the back of the room, technically present as a representative of the Criminal Investigation Command, but actually serving as my backup in case things went sideways. She'd briefed me on the morning's developments. Lieutenant Sullivan's platoon had successfully documented the Taliban ambush positions, and airstrikes had eliminated the threat with no American casualties. But questions were already being asked about how the mission parameters had changed so suddenly. The President entered at precisely 1,400 hours, followed by the Secretary of Defense and a collection of generals whose combined stars could have formed their own constellation. I snapped to attention, along with everyone else in the room, feeling the weight of the moment settling around me like armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," the President began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "we are gathered here today to honor an exceptional soldier who exemplifies the very best of American military values. Sergeant First Class Sarah Henderson demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, making a split-second decision that saved American and Afghan lives while disrupting enemy operations." The citation was read aloud, the official version that turned my moment of moral crisis into something suitable for press releases and history books. It mentioned my refusal to engage what appeared to be an enemy combatant, my squad's subsequent tactical reposition, and the successful elimination of a Taliban ambush. It did not mention the months of uncertainty that followed, the investigation that nearly ended my career, or the family that had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. It certainly didn't mention Operation Acceptable Losses, or the men in suits who treated soldier deaths like line items in a budget. The President stepped forward with the Medal of Honor, its star-shaped pendant catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." As he placed the ribbon around my neck, I felt the weight of the medal against my chest. Not just the physical weight of the metal and fabric, but the weight of everything it represented. The soldiers who had died because someone had decided their lives were acceptable losses. The families who had received folded flags instead of living children. The system that treated human beings like expendable resources in service of strategies they'd never understand. The ceremony concluded with handshakes and photographs, the kind of carefully choreographed conclusion that would play well on the evening news. But as the crowd began to disperse, I noticed several men in suits who had been standing along the walls during the ceremony. They weren't celebrating, they were watching, waiting, calculating. One of them approached as I was saying goodbye to my family. "Sergeant Henderson?" "I'm Deputy Director Morrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I wonder if we might have a word." I looked at Captain Walsh, who had moved closer and was observing the interaction with professional interest. About what? About some irregularities in last night's communications traffic. It seems someone with access to classified information was providing tactical advice to combat units in Afghanistan without proper authorization. The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. The confrontation between the soldier who'd chosen conscience over orders and the system that demanded unquestioning obedience. Is that a problem? I asked. It is when that interference disrupts legitimate military operations and compromises ongoing intelligence activities. I smiled, feeling something settle into place. Not just confidence, but certainty. The same feeling I'd had 5 years ago when I'd refused to pull the trigger on a 12-year-old boy carrying medical supplies. Deputy Director Morrison, are you referring to the legitimate military operation that would have resulted in 14 dead Americans walking into a prepared ambush? Or the ongoing intelligence activities that involve withholding life-saving information from combat units? His expression didn't change, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that I was willing to engage directly instead of deflecting or denying. I think this conversation would be better conducted in a more private setting. I think you're right. I looked around the East Room, at the flags and portraits and symbols of American democracy. How about we have it right here, in front of witnesses, with the press still in the building? Behind Morrison, I could see other men in suits moving closer, forming a loose circle that looked casual, but felt like a containment strategy. Captain Walsh had her phone out, probably recording the conversation. Sergeant Henderson, you're making allegations that could be considered treasonous. No, Deputy Director. I'm making allegations that could be considered factual. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded document. Not one of the classified files Captain Walsh had shown me, but something else entirely. This is a sworn statement from Lieutenant Sullivan, 2nd Platoon Bravo Company, describing how he received advance warning of a Taliban ambush that would have killed his entire squad. Along with photographic evidence of the prepared positions and enemy forces that your intelligence briefings somehow failed to mention. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. That operation was classified. You had no authority to interfere. I had the authority that comes with wearing this uniform, I said, touching the Medal of Honor at my throat. The authority to protect American soldiers from being used as expendable assets in someone else's strategic game. The room had gone quiet around us. Other ceremony attendees were starting to notice the confrontation, and I could see White House staff members whispering urgently into their communication devices. You have no proof of any systematic wrongdoing, Morrison said. Don't I? I pulled out my phone and held it up so everyone could see the screen. Captain Walsh, would you like to share what your investigation has uncovered about Operation Acceptable Losses? Walsh stepped forward, her expression professionally neutral but her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Over the past 18 months, we've documented 17 incidents where American combat units were provided with incomplete or deliberately misleading intelligence that resulted in unnecessary casualties. In each case, the missing information was available at higher classification levels, but was not shared with the soldiers who needed it most. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he wasn't finished. These are serious allegations that require proper investigation through appropriate channels. The appropriate channels are the ones that have been getting soldiers killed, I interrupted. The appropriate channels are run by people who think American lives are acceptable losses in service of prolonged engagement strategies that benefit defense contractors and career bureaucrats. I looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from shocked to confused to frightened. My family was staring at me like they'd never seen me before, which, in a way, they hadn't. They'd known Sarah Henderson, the disappointment, the failure, the daughter who'd refused to be what they wanted her to be. They were meeting Sarah Henderson, the soldier, the one who'd learned that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to follow orders. Deputy Director Morrison, I have a question for you, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. How many American soldiers have to die before their lives stop being acceptable losses? How many families have to get folded flags instead of living children before someone in your organization develops a conscience? He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because we both knew that there wasn't a number. There would always be another strategic objective, another operational requirement, another reason why some soldiers were more expendable than others. The Medal of Honor is supposed to represent the highest ideals of military service, I continued. Courage, sacrifice, putting the welfare of others above your own safety. Today, I'm using those ideals to expose a system that treats soldiers like laboratory rats in someone else's experiment. I turned to face the crowd, seeing faces I recognized from the military and political establishment. People who'd spent careers climbing hierarchies and managing bureaucracies. People who'd forgotten that every decision they made had human consequences. 5 years ago, I refused to shoot a 12-year-old boy because I knew it was wrong. Today, I'm refusing to stay quiet about a system that's been getting soldiers killed because I know that's wrong too. I touched the medal again, feeling its weight. If that makes me unfit for military service, if that makes me a traitor or a troublemaker or whatever other label you want to apply, then so be it. The room erupted in chaos. Journalists shouting questions, officials trying to restore order, family members looking stunned and proud and terrified. But through it all, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete certainty that I was doing the right thing. Captain Walsh appeared at my side as security personnel moved to escort Morrison and his colleagues out of the room. That was either very brave or very stupid, she said quietly. Maybe both. I looked at my family, who were pushing through the crowd to reach me. But it was necessary. My father reached me first, his eyes bright with something that looked like wonder. Sarah, what you just did. What I just did was my job, Dad. The job you taught me. To protect and serve. To put others before myself. To stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like aftershave and old flannel, like farm equipment and Nebraska soil, like home. I'm proud of you, he whispered, not because of the medal, but because of who you chose to be when it mattered most. Over his shoulder, I could see the White House staff trying to manage the chaos. The journalist documenting what would probably be the most unusual Medal of Honor ceremony in history. And the men in suits who were realizing that their carefully constructed system of acceptable losses had just been exposed to the world. Tomorrow, there would be congressional hearings and criminal investigations and career-ending consequences for a lot of people who thought they were untouchable. There would be reforms and resignations and probably a few court-martial proceedings. But tonight, there was just a soldier who'd chosen conscience over orders, standing in the White House surrounded by family who finally understood what that choice had cost and what it had meant. The Medal of Honor felt lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because I was finally worthy of carrying it. They'd called me a coward for refusing to shoot. Now they'd learn what real courage looked like when it was aimed at the right target. If you felt Sarah's fight was your fight, comment, courage. If you believe soldiers deserve leaders who value their lives over political objectives, type honor. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about heroes who refuse to stay silent when silence costs lives.